Karen Churchill is no stranger to this programme, and it's lovely to welcome her back to talk about two things. Obviously the action, but there is a GoFundMe fundraising initiative to raise money to support legal actions against the government for failing to protect the public, to implement health protection measures when rolling 5G out across this country. It's a pleasure to welcome Karen Churchill back to the programme. Hello, Karen. Happy New Year to you. I hope I can still say that on the 10th of January.
Yes.
How are you?
Happy New Year, Richie. We're marching through January already, aren't we?
We're marching through. I can't wait to get to the end of it because I'm doing the dry January thing and I'm going good guns at the moment. So I'm going to do my best.
Well done, you.
Well, thanks very much. Listen, you've been busy since we last spoke because in December there was a significant occurrence, wasn't there, with respect to your case against the government, and that is papers were served on the Secretary of State for Health and the Secretary of State for Levelling Up and Housing on December 21st. Tell us about this. This is exciting news.
Absolutely. Yes, it is exciting, Richie. Yes, what happened back in September, we filed the challenge, which we're pointing out to the two departments what the failure of the local risk reconciliation, the consequences of the local authorities not addressing the health and environmental impacts. And we gave them, they asked for an extension to respond to this challenge and the details that we had presented to them, and they failed to respond. So it gave, we had no other option other than to take a judicial review to challenge their lack of action in relation to what we're putting on the table. In the letter of the law, there's a direct assignment to the local authorities to actually actively look at the risks when they're making decisions. And this step is being sidestepped in the majority of cases across the country. They are being instructed by government policy not to look at the risks, whereas actually in the letter of law, they have that role to perform.
Karen, is there documentation showing the government giving these instructions to local authorities not to consider the risks before making a decision?
Absolutely. It's in the National Planning Policy Framework. There's a policy, it used to be 118, it's just been updated, but in there it says you should not set health safeguards other than ICNIRP. So what happens is the planning authorities receive a piece of paper which says that they are complying to those exposure guidelines. And in the very first instance, the planning authorities aren't looking at where the exclusion zones are according to that exposure guideline. So what's happening is you've got residents that are actually living inside public exclusion zones, and those masts are being passed without that exclusion zone, the position of that exclusion zone being checked. And we've actually got another judicial review against a case like that happening in Cheltenham at the moment. So we're challenging a mast that's gone up 17 metres in direct line of sight of the head of the mast. It's a 5-storey building, only 17 metres away from the antenna. And the local authority, Cheltenham Borough Council, had even when challenged and said, look, this is pretty close, it's right outside my bedroom window, absolutely no account of that residence, the impact of that residence taken into account when they passed that mast.
Karen, there's much to get into here. We'll talk about ICNIRP in a second. Where these masts have been erected and turned on, for want of a better way of putting it, do we have any evidence at all that people in those areas become less well or contact their doctors or their healthcare people to complain about certain illnesses or certain issues? Is there an increase in general kind of ill health in areas where these have gone up? Has anybody looked into this?
Yes, well, Leonard Hardell has done some research in Sweden and produced a report where a couple living directly under a 5G antenna became very unwell after the installation. So we've got scientific science, and then there's a long history of science that show that if you live near a base station, you're likely to have increased headaches, nausea, tinnitus, trouble with concentration. And the New Hampshire report spent a year looking at all the studies, and they found that the lab studies and the epidemiology both point to the necessity of a 500-meter setback. And at the moment in this country, for a 5G mast under ICNIRP, they're saying you need about a 50-meter setback, sort of a 10-meter drop from the antenna. So really, that's grossly inadequate. At least 500 meters is needed, according to the science.
Let me talk a little bit about ICNIRP because it comes up and it's come up when we've spoken before. So for listeners who've never heard of ICNIRP, it stands for International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection. And it is claimed to be, I know Karen is going to have kittens here when I say this, but it is claimed to be an independent organisation, provides scientific advice and guidance on the health and environmental effects of non-ionising radiation. Now, ICNIRP claims, and has claimed in recent years, that it spent 7 years studying how to improve the protection for people when coming into contact with higher frequency waves covering 5G, but also AM and DAB radio, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth. And it says it's safe and that these technologies are safe if they adhere to recognised standards. And that's a really interesting comment, that the technology is safe if it adheres to recognised standards. Does ICNIRP accept the 500 metre exclusion zone? Where
No,
it
not
doesn't?
at all.
No?
No. According to ICNIRP, the public exclusion zone, the area in which they advise that is a protective distance, is around 50 meters. But the science, according to the New Hampshire Commission, says that at least 500 meters. So ICNIRP don't recognise that. And also, even within the ICNIRP guideline, there's in the small print, there's a exposure level set to protect people from microwave hearing, and that's at a fraction of the recommended levels generally that they refer to. And this is not being recognised by Ofcom. It's not being recognised by the local authorities. They say Ofcom, we haven't measured any breach of ICNIRP across the country, but they have in Hatfield, Charing Cross and somewhere else. The levels recorded were 15 times the limit for microwave hearing. But nobody knows about microwave hearing. They're not acknowledging it. And what our case is seeking to do is to create the procedural standard whereby that risk is included in the decision making when they decide where to place the mast.
I've looked into ICNIRP over the years, and it claims not to receive any money from the industry. But that's not entirely true, that. It is given grants, and it claims it receives grants from international organisations and organisations based in countries where this technology is being rolled out. But that's always been pretty easy to circumnavigate. Like if you ran a tech company and you were interested in putting up 5G masts, it's pretty easy to get around that and to subsidise other organisations, which could then obviously fund or send money to ICNIRP. So it definitely, we know that it is funded partly by the industry, don't we, despite its claims not to be.
Yes. And I think what we're trying to do with our case is take the emphasis away from ICNIRP and place the emphasis on the failed procedures, because once you tackle the inconsistencies that are happening, the way these masts are being processed, then we can reclaim our power against ICNIRP and what ICNIRP say, because we have a right as an objector for the evidence that we put on the table to be fully taken into account. So in a way, we're seeking to enforce a proper risk assessment to include all information. And I think one of the phrases we like to use is the science is in, and this science has to be accounted for. And it was difficult to get the science accounted for in the Action Against 5G case because the courts are slow to look at the actual science. Whereas what our case is about is what we've revealed is all the different authorities are processing applications in slightly different ways, but they're even failing. The door opener is the fact that they're failing to even apply the ICNIRP standard with these exclusion zones by not taking any responsibility for looking at where those exclusion zones are.
This is very clever, I think, Karen. This is very clever. Sorry to cut across you. Finish that thought now in a sec, but this is clever. Not to get bogged down arguing about the science, but to say, look, leave the science to one side for a second. There is a set of steps, a procedure that is laid down in law that needs to be followed before one of these masks goes up. And this is failing from step one. So this is clever, because I imagine your opponents will try, and not just your opponents, but anybody who wants to take on the erection of these masts. I suppose the first thing they do is try and label people as NIMBYs, not in my backyard, or label them as crazy conspiracy theorists or whatever. But that's not the key. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. They like to cast doubts, like they did with the smoking, over the science. So, as you say, if we move the emphasis away from what the science is at the outset and say, actually, you're trying to impose a policy and follow a guideline, and you're pretending that it's a procedural, it's a standard, where it's not a standard, it's just a guideline, and that guideline is just evidence that needs to be weighed up with other evidence. So, for example, across the country, most councils will say, when challenged, oh, we can't take health into account because that's what the government have led them to believe. But it's not true. And that's why we're challenging the government to change that policy, because we've got an example now of Mendip, who did look at the evidence, and they chose to refuse the mast on health grounds. We presented the 500 meters, and there was a man with metal implants, and we said, look, the exposure guidelines don't apply to him. He's likely to be harmed. We had a doctor giving evidence about that. And then the Mendip Planning Board went against the Mendip Council's recommendation that, we can fulfill our legal obligations by applying policy. Well, they couldn't, and they didn't when they refused that mast. So now we can use that success in other councils. When the council says, no, we can't take into account, we say, yes, you can. Mendip did. Why can't you?
Remind us, Karen. Remind us what is Mendip? Remind us.
Mendip is a district council in Somerset. So it's a planning authority in Somerset, and we had a 5G mast application. The first one came up in Frome, and we raised 200 objections and presented them the evidence, and we asked questions of their jurisdiction. So we say, what are your obligations under the European Code to reconcile the risks? And they said, oh, yes, we should be reconciling the risks. And the way we do that is applying policy. And that's what they told the planning board. But when we presented all the evidence to the planning board, they said, actually, no, we're not going to rely on policy. There is a legal mechanism by which we can refuse this mast on health grounds, and we're going to refuse it. So that is the only council that we know of that has made a decision based on the health implications after looking at the evidence itself.
And you know what, Karen, it occurs to me that it's untenable for a local authority to say, we're not taking the health risk into consideration when making a decision because the government told us not to. That doesn't really absolve a local authority from litigation in the future. I mean, they must be stupid if they believe it does, because, you end up in court and you say, well, Your Honour, the government told us not to check whether it was healthy or not. I mean, any, half decent judge would say, well, I mean, you're an adult human male or human female. You know better than that. Like, whether government said it or not, you still have the responsibility to say, well, we're going to check and look into it in any case. So they've got to be worried about this in the future. I would imagine local authorities.
I think there's what people's visceral reaction to this, and the sort of, the gut feeling, and then there's the technicalities of planning law. And a lot of planners, to be fair to them, they're doing their best according to their instruction to apply planning law, because if they don't, if they refuse a mast on health grounds, they're frightened that they're going to lose on appeal, and then that's going to be costly to them. So the financial implications are a consideration for them. But absolutely, this is what's happening in Cheltenham. We went to Cheltenham and said, look, this lady's only 17 metres away, she's vulnerable. They're saying, oh no, we're following the law, we can't. So the fight in Cheltenham is to point out the detail of the case law, the detail of the European Code, the planning principles, and to create some clarity in the procedure and that should be happening, because they're relying on this single policy, thinking that they're obeying the law, thinking that that's what keeps them safe from being challenged by the telecoms company, and they think that they don't have to make their own mind up as to what the impacts are. But you're absolutely right. Once we present to the councils, look, the science says you need 500 metre setback. I think once you get people thinking about how far away from that mast am I safe, what are the real implications, at what distance? And then on top of that, you've got hotspots. So how does the emissions from one mast interfere with another mast and with all my other EMF emitting devices? And even the WHO organization, the researchers saying, yes, there are hotspots, and actually we're experimenting in how to mitigate those hotspots. In Amsterdam, they set up an experiment and they found a way of deflecting or nullifying the hotspots, and indoor plants started to grow better. So it's really behind the times to be in a position of, non-ionizing radiation has no effects, and we're daft to think they do. We're so beyond that point in the true scientific understanding. It's just the political representation of the science is very misleading.
We're speaking with Karen Churchill now. Karen and Neil McDougall are taking legal action against the Health Secretary and the Secretary of State for Levelling Up in Housing and Communities. The sealed judicial review application was served to both of them in December. They've requested a 2-week extension to respond because of the holiday. So this is proceeding. It's important work, this, dear listener. I would ask you to go to gofundme.com, and I'm going to put a link to this on the podcast notes later. Look for Litigants in Person Protecting Public Health, or if you put GoFundMe and Karen Churchill into a search engine, you'll find the page straight away. They're looking to raise just over 10 grand for the fees. They're not doing too bad. They're coming up on 1,900 quid. Now, I'll bung you a few quid myself later on, Karen, that's a promise. And I'll put radio show as a reference so you'll know it's us. So if you can support this, do support it, because it's massively important, this, right? Because it's the Wild West out there. If they have their way. Get right in, Karen, go ahead.
Thanks, Richie. I just want to encourage all the listeners that are listening in that they too can print off the submission. They can organise to speak to their ward councillors and ask their council to become an interested party in this case, because each council has their own responsibility to find out what their legal obligations are. So, anybody who's out there, you don't have to know all the detail yourself. You just print off the submission and give it to your ward councillor. And in Appendix 2, there's a list of all the remedies that are needed in order to, even at the outset, establish this a firm procedure. If I can just give you an example, Richie.
Go ahead.
Matt Warman, he was a defendant on our first case, action against 5G, and we were challenging him to clarify, the risks of 5G. And what happened in his constituency in the summer, the locals, a mast was passed outside a school, and his constituents were really upset about it. And he agreed it was a sensitive issue, and he rang EE and arranged for EE not to go ahead. I mean, that just is such an example of how regulation is failing.
Yeah.
Not all constituents have got Matt Warman, who, with friends in high places, who can fix the situation once their masts have gone up outside their schools. And that just shows you how ridiculous and the procedures are in terms of what should be happening.
Loads of comments. Can I read some comments? Ardell has people are getting onto us through the app. Ardell says this is extremely interesting. As a new 15-metre 5G mast was erected today at the end of my road, it was appealed by nearby residents and the council ignored them. That's from Ardell. 15-metre 5G mast at the end of his road. There's 2 or 3 around us here in Salford. Would you believe it, Karen? But not within more than a half a kilometre from where I'm based at the moment. Luckily enough for me, I suppose it's not about me, but it won't be lucky for those who are near them. But we're surrounded by several schools, a huge hospital, and Media City is only just down the road from here, so they're going up everywhere. That was Ardell. He said the council ignored them. Maybe they didn't have access. Maybe those who were protesting didn't have the information that Karen has given there, and which is on the fundraiser page, gofundme.com. Look for Karen Churchill. Just 1 or 2 more of these. This is a health-based one from Rob, who had a sudden onset of tinnitus about 2 years ago. It tied in with the installation of a 5G mast 50 metres from his home. They're moving at the moment. There isn't a mast where he is heading, and he's praying it clears up. It drives him insane. Now, I know you're focusing on the law around the proper procedure in terms of doing the proper applications and all of that in order for masts to be put up, but you can't ignore the health, and these are the types of comments that come in when we do shows like this. I guess you won't be surprised when you hear Rob say he had tinnitus when he was next to a 5G mast 50 metres away. Do you get a lot of this, Karen?
Absolutely, a lot of it, and what we are seeking to do is empower him to be able to file a statutory nuisance complaint, and the such that the council have to respond, and once he objects, they have to respond. So the procedure has mammoth implications for the rights of people to protect themselves from these conditions.
Thanks, Karen. Let me read one or 2 more of these. Bob is buying EMF shielding paint. He's got to save for it. It isn't cheap. He lives in a building and is surrounded by all sorts of microwave frequencies. He says also EDF is now stopping support for prepayment meters. We all need radiation pulsating meters, he says, the trackers. Yeah, we own our own home, Karen, and we do not have a smart meter. But not a month goes by without an email or a letter from the power company urging us to have the smart meter. There seems to be a run at the moment on people, or pressure coming to bear on people from the power supply companies, the energy companies, to have smart meters? Because you said this a minute ago, it isn't just 5G towers in your neighbourhood, it's everything else. It's Wi-Fi, and of course it's smart meters, isn't it? And you know, it's a bit of a soup really for people these days, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's the exponential increase that will have the ongoing chronic and long-term effects, Richie. It's the accumulation throughout the day across different devices, and that's what's not being taken into account. Each individual source may, apply to this particular inadequate guideline, but what about the accumulative effects of all these different sources acting together? Who's considering that? It's ridiculous.
We've had one. It's when you think about it, it is preposterous. Jan is in Swansea. Hi, Jan. Can you tell Karen, Richie, our local council is crowing that Swansea Bay is going to become a, quote, living laboratory for 5G, end quote. Jan, I'd love you to send me a link to that. I'm not doubting Jan for a minute, but she says the council is claiming Swansea Bay will become a living laboratory for 5G. I mean, it's reckless, this, isn't it? I mean, it's
absolutely reckless. The science is in, the harms are there, the risks should be being taken into account. It's absolutely ridiculous that they're not. And what we've noticed with the planning applications, they are upping their literature, their glossy literature, which conveys a very misleading picture of the effect of the radiation. And I think for anybody listening, it's just keep focused, keep informed, and assert your rights. We have rights, and the submission is asserting those rights. We have a right to protect ourselves. And once you can use the literature to assert that, don't hold back. Don't feel like it's a done deal. It may feel like it's a done deal and it's accelerating, and in some ways it is, but we've stopped, across the UK, 68% of masts in the last 2 years have been stopped and refused at planning. And as I said before, only one on health grounds, but we do suspect that some of the masts are being refused because the case officers are recognising the health effects, but they're putting it down to, oh, it's too tall or too ugly for this particular location because they fear being sued. But I think we will make progress and we will get these adverse health effects on the table, because through this challenge that we're making, to force them to apply the procedures that they should be applying, because once they know they can, then there's more likelihood, and we can then keep pressing with the evidence that they should. So it's a step-by-step procedure, and anybody listening is just please go to rfinfo.co.uk and use the templates there, print off the submission. And the way to really challenge a council is to assert your rights, and our rights are very clearly laid out in that submission, especially Appendix 2. It's a very long submission. It's full of legal detail, but in Appendix 2 there's a list of information that a council should be considering before deciding a mast. And we are in a very strong position if we have people knowing that information and using it. And again, you don't have to become an expert yourself. It's all there within the submission. But what we need is people using that submission to assert their rights. And then it takes the whole framework away from persuasion and victimhood to a position of assertion and just accountability. And that's the beauty of the progression in the UK campaign. We were with the Cheltenham, we're pushing up from the bottom, and with this case against the Secretary of State, we're pushing down from the top. Because you could say the local authorities are being put in a corner, that they don't even realise they're so cornered by this faulty, unlawful policy. So but they do have a responsibility to find out and stand up like we are, stand up against telecoms and say, no, the evidence is in. We do have to protect the public. We have that duty. But by pushing up from the bottom and through the Cheltenham judicial review and then pushing down from the top, we will make progress, and we'll make more progress. And the more people out there who know that they have this power tool to call for accountability, all these steps make a difference.
Karen, well done, and good luck with the case. Obviously, you're awaiting news, and hopefully you'll have news soon. I'm going to put the link to the information you've given us on the podcast notes. That's the GoFundMe page. The programme has just made a donation to the funds, and I see one or two listeners have done so as well, and I hope you'll get more support in the coming days. Listen, it's hugely important. I really appreciate you for doing it and for coming on to talk about it, and I know you'll come back on when there is more news, Karen. But great stuff. Godspeed to you.
Thank you, Richie. Lovely to speak to you again. Thank you for your support.
My pleasure. You're very welcome. Karen Churchill, one of the litigants taking the Secretary for Health and the Secretary of State for Levelling Up in Communities, taking them to court for the failure to protect people, for the failure to protect basically every man, woman and child in this country from telecoms companies who want to put up 5G masts in communities. Telling local authorities, forget about the health impact of this, forget about it. It's not your jurisdiction, just approve the planning requests. That's basically what the government has said. So, important stuff that. We'll keep an eye on that one. Like I said again, I will put the GoFundMe page link on the podcast notes a little bit later on. It's exactly 5 o'clock UK time. I'm live from Salford. It's the Richie Allen Show, Wednesday's programme, January 10th, 2024. Lots of comments on this. Thank you for them. Use the app, use the website. Bill has been in touch to say, he says Metro paid meters are a scam. Every £2 out of every £10 spent goes to the landlord for what they claim is maintenance, when these things are maintenance free. I think it is borderline whether these are legal. Landlords are installing these en masse because they can make a lot of money from installing them. They are not smart meters though, says Bill. I didn't know this, Bill. This is brand new information to me. So if you rent from a landlord and he puts a prepaid meter into your property where you've got to pay as you go, if it's Metro paid, you're telling me that the landlord gets a couple of quid out of every 10 quid spent. Is that right? Jesus, that's robbery, to say the least. I mean, they're not happy with the exorbitant rent fees they're taking from people today. And Dave has been in touch with me because Jan was in touch with me. Thank you, Jan. And then Dave has been in touch to send me a link to this story about Swansea. I'm just going to open it now if I can. Tell you what, I'm doing it on the fly. Swansea University, and this is Swansea University's website now, to develop world first research and innovation living lab, creating a living laboratory in the Swansea Bay City region. Swansea University will develop a world-first research and innovation environment that harnesses a 5G infrastructure, wait for it, to improve population health and well-being. That's an inversion. With the award of a £2.5 million project that will create a living lab in the Swansea Bay City region. Jesus, Mary and Joseph. Wow. Swansea Uni, a world's first 5G infrastructure in Swansea Bay to create a living laboratory. Wow, to study the physical, mental well-being and performance of people in the region to reduce the burden on the NHS. If a James Bond villain was to say something like that, you might understand it. It's 3 minutes past the hour.